Samuel Hayes never thought he'd end up living alone at 32. Growing up, he always pictured himself with a wife and kids running around the ranch, just like his parents had. But life has a funny way of changing your plans, and Samuel's plans got crushed 3 years ago, when the woman he was going to marry decided she wanted something better. Catherine was her name, and she was the prettiest girl in their small Montana town. Samuel had saved up for months to buy her a ring, worked extra hours fixing fences and herding cattle. He was so sure she loved him the way he loved her. Then one morning, she knocked on his door with tears in her eyes and told him she was leaving, with Mr. Peterson, the new banker who'd moved to town. She said she was sorry, but Peterson could give her things Samuel never could. A big house in the city, fancy dresses, and a life without dirt under her fingernails. That day Samuel felt something break inside his chest. Not just his heart, but his trust in people. He realized that love wasn't enough if you couldn't provide the kind of life someone dreamed of. So he decided right then and there that he was better off alone. The ranch kept him busy enough anyway. His father had left him 300 acres of good land, 50 head of cattle, and a dozen horses. It was honest work, the kind that made your muscles ache and your hands rough, but it paid the bills. Samuel would wake up before sunrise. Check. On the animals, mend whatever needed fixing, and fall into bed exhausted every night. The routine was simple, predictable, and safe. The townspeople tried to help at first. Mrs. Johnson from the general store was always mentioning her niece, who was such a sweet girl and good with cooking. The preacher's wife would invite Samuel to Sunday dinner and mysteriously have an extra single lady there. Even his neighbor, old Pete, would stop by with his daughter whenever she visited from back east. But Samuel wasn't interested. He'd gotten good at making polite excuses and changing the subject. After a while, people stopped trying. They'd nod to him when he came to town for supplies, ask about his cattle, and leave it at that. Samuel preferred it this way. No expectations, no disappointments, and definitely no broken promises. His routine was the same every day. Up at 5 in the morning, coffee black and strong, then out to check the barn. The horses always nickered when they heard his boots on the wooden floor. There was something comforting about animals. They didn't lie to you or leave you for someone better. They just needed food, water, and a gentle hand. The barn was Samuel's favorite place on the ranch. His grandfather had built it with thick wooden beams and a loft for storing hay. Even in the worst storms, it stayed warm and dry. Samuel had spent countless hours there as a boy, helping his father with the horses and listening to stories about the old days. Winter was always the hardest time. The days were short, the nights were long, and the cold seemed to seep into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. This particular February was especially brutal. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and the wind howled like a wild animal. Samuel had to check the barn every few hours to make sure the animals were safe and the roof wasn't leaking. He'd learned to read the weather like other people read books. The way the clouds gathered, the smell in the air, the way the horses acted nervous. This storm was going to be a bad one. He could feel it in his bones, the way old-timers always said they could on the third morning of the blizzard. Samuel bundled up in his heaviest coat and boots. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him over as he fought his way to the barn. Snow stung his face like tiny needles, and he could barely see 5 feet in front of him. This was the kind of weather that could kill a person if they weren't careful. The horses were restless, stamping their feet and snorting. Samuel calmed them with quiet words and gentle touches, the way his father had taught him. He was checking the hay supply in the loft when he heard something that made him freeze. It wasn't the wind or the animals. It was something else entirely, a soft sound like crying or whimpering. Samuel stood perfectly still, listening. There it was again. His heart started beating faster. Could be a wild animal that had gotten trapped, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But something about the sound made the hair on the back of his neck stand. Up, he climbed the ladder to the loft slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden rungs. The sound was coming from the far corner where old horse blankets were stored. Samuel moved carefully, not wanting to scare whatever was there. What he found made him stop breathing altogether. It was a woman. A young woman in a white dress. curled up in the hay like a wounded animal. Her skin was pale as milk, her lips blue with cold. Her dark hair was wet with melted snow, and her whole body was shaking. In her hand, she clutched a piece of paper so tightly her knuckles were white. For a moment, Samuel just stood there, not believing what he was seeing. How did a woman in a wedding dress end up in his barn? Where did she come from? The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the town was even farther. Nobody could have walked that far in this storm, but those questions didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she was barely conscious and clearly freezing to death. Samuel had seen frostbite before, and he knew how dangerous it could be. Every second counted. He knelt down beside her and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes opened slowly as she looked at him with confusion and fear. She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. Samuel couldn't make out the words, but he could see the desperation in her eyes. "Easy now," he said softly, the way he talked to frightened horses. "You're safe. I'm going to help you." Without thinking about it, Samuel scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and she felt cold even through his thick coat. He carried her down from the loft and out of the barn, fighting against the wind and snow. The house wasn't far, but it felt like miles with the storm raging around them. Samuel's mind was racing as he struggled toward the house. He'd sworn off women, sworn off caring about anyone but himself, but he couldn't just leave someone to die in his barn. That wasn't the kind of man his father had raised him to be. No matter how much his heart had been broken, as he reached his front door, Samuel realized his quiet, simple life was about to change. He just didn't know how much. Samuel kicked open his front door and rushed inside, still carrying the shivering woman in his arms. The warmth of his house hit them like a wall, and he could feel her body relaxing slightly against his chest. But she was still dangerously cold, and he knew he had to act fast. He laid her down on the old couch near his fireplace, the same couch where he'd spent countless lonely evenings reading or just staring at the flames. She looked so small and fragile there, like a broken doll someone had thrown away. Her wedding dress was torn in several places, and he could see scratches on her arms, where she'd probably crawled through bush or fence wire. Samuel threw more wood on the fire and poked at the coals until the flames roared higher. Then he grabbed every blanket he could find and wrapped them around her. She was conscious but barely, her eyes fluttering open and closed like she was fighting to stay awake. "What's your name?" he asked gently, kneeling beside the couch. "Can you tell me your name?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Samuel waited patiently, the way you wait for a spooked horse to calm down. Finally, she managed to whisper something that sounded like Elena. "Elena," he repeated, and she nodded weakly. "Okay, Elena, you're safe now. I'm Samuel. This is my house, and you're going to be fine." He went to the kitchen and heated some milk on the stove, adding a bit of honey the way his mother used to make it when he was sick as a child. When he came back, Elena was more alert, though still shaking from the cold. She accepted the warm milk gratefully, wrapping her small hands around the mug like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Slowly," Samuel warned as she started to drink too fast. "Small sips." As the warmth spread through her body, Elena began to look around the room. Samuel watched her take in the simple furniture, the books on the shelf, the photos of his family on the mantel. She seemed surprised by something, though he couldn't figure out what. "This ISN single quotes ... she started to say, then stopped herself. "Isn't what?" Samuel asked. Elena looked down at the crumpled paper still clutched in her hand. She smoothed it out carefully, and Samuel could see it was a letter, though he couldn't read the words from where he sat. "I was supposed to be somewhere else," she said quietly. "I was supposed to be married by now." Samuel felt his stomach tighten. A runaway bride. That explained the wedding dress and why she was alone in a storm. But it didn't explain why she'd ended up in his barn instead of wherever she was supposed to be. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Start from the beginning." Elena took a shaky breath and began her story. She'd grown up in New York City, working in a factory that made women's gloves. The pay was terrible, as she lived in a tiny room with 2 other girls. Her parents had died when she was young and she had no other family to speak of. I saw an advertisement in the newspaper, she explained. A man out west looking for a wife. He seemed kind in his letters and he promised a good life on his ranch. I thought maybe it was my chance for something better. Samuel nodded, though. Something cold was growing in his chest. He'd heard about mail-order brides before, but he'd never met one. It seemed like such a desperate thing to do, traveling across the country to marry a complete stranger. His name was Thomas Brennan. Elena continued. He wrote to me for 3 months. He told me about his ranch, his horses, his dreams for the future. He said he needed a wife who wasn't afraid of hard work, someone who wanted to build a life together. She paused to take another sip of milk, and Samuel waited. He could see this was hard for her to talk about. I sold everything I owned to buy. The train ticket, she said. It took me 4 days to get here. I was so nervous, but also excited. I thought I was finally going to have a real home, maybe even a family someday. Samuel's jaw tightened. He had a feeling he knew where this story was going, and he didn't like it. Thomas was supposed to meet me at the train station, Elena went on. When I got off the train, I looked around for someone who matched his description. Tall, brown hair, about 40 years old. There was only one man there, and he was looking at me like he was expecting someone. She stopped and stared into the fire, and Samuel could see tears forming in her eyes. I walked up to him and said, "Are you Thomas Brennan?" And he looked me up and down like I was a horse he was thinking about buying. Then he said, "You're not what I expected." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "What did you do?" I asked him what he meant, Elena said. I had sent him a photograph, just like he asked. But he said the picture must have been old, or maybe I looked different in person. He said I was too skinny, too foreign-looking. Not the kind of wife he really wanted. The anger in Samuel's chest was growing hotter. He'd met Thomas Brennan a few times in town, and the man had always struck him as arrogant and selfish. But this was worse than Samuel had imagined. But he'd already paid for the wedding, Elena continued. The preacher was waiting, and he didn't want to waste the money. So he said maybe we could work something out. Work something out? Samuel repeated. Elena nodded, fresh tears rolling down her cheeks. He said I could stay and work as his housekeeper instead. No marriage, just work. He'd give me a place to sleep and food to eat in exchange for cooking and cleaning. He said it was better than what I'd left behind in New York. Samuel wanted to punch something. The idea of any man treating a woman like that, especially one who traveled so far and risked so much, made his blood boil. I told him that wasn't what we agreed on, Elena said. I didn't come all this way to be a servant. I came to be a wife, to have a partner. So he got angry and said if I didn't like his offer, I could find my own way back to New York. And then, what happened? He put me in his wagon and said he'd take me to his ranch so I could think about it. But halfway there, he stopped and told me to get out. He said he'd changed his mind about the whole thing. He didn't want a wife or a housekeeper, he just wanted me gone. Samuel couldn't believe what he was hearing. He left you in the middle of nowhere? In a storm? Elena nodded. He threw my bag out of the wagon and drove away. I tried to follow the road, but the snow was getting worse. I couldn't see anything, and I was so cold. I thought I was going to die out there. She looked at Samuel with gratitude in her eyes. I saw your barn and thought maybe I could wait out the storm. I didn't mean to trespass, I just didn't know what else to do. Samuel felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about a woman who needed help. This was about a person who'd been treated cruelly, who'd risked everything for a chance at a better life only to be thrown away like garbage. You're not trespassing, he said firmly. And you're not going anywhere until this storm passes and you're completely well? Elena looked surprised. But I don't have anywhere to go. I spent all my money on the train ticket, and I can't go back to New York with nothing. Samuel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the still raging storm. He thought about his own loneliness, his own disappointment with love. But this was different. This was about basic human decency. We'll figure that out later, he said. Right now, you need to rest and get warm. As he turned back to look at Elena, Samuel realized that his quiet, predictable life had just become very complicated. What started as one night turned into 2, then 3, then a week. The storm finally passed, but Elena was still weak from her ordeal. Samuel told himself he was just being decent, making sure she was healthy enough to travel before sending her on her way. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Elena wasn't what he'd expected. She wasn't helpless or demanding like he thought a city woman would be. On her second day, while Samuel was out checking the cattle, she cleaned his entire kitchen and made a pot of stew that smelled better than anything he'd cooked in years. When he came back and found her standing at the stove, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, something in his chest tightened. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Hanging his coat on the peg by the door, Elena turned around, and he noticed she'd found one of his old shirts and a pair of work pants that were too big for her. She'd rolled up the sleeves and tied a rope around her waist like a belt. Somehow, she made even his shabby clothes look good. "I wanted to," she said simply. "You saved my life. It's the least I can do." Samuel wasn't used to gratitude. He wasn't used to having someone take care of him. Either, for 3 years he'd been cooking his own meals, washing his own clothes, and coming home to an empty house. Having Elena there felt strange, but not bad strange. Just different. The stew was delicious, better than anything his mother used to make. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Samuel found himself stealing glances at Elena, watching the way she ate carefully, like she was savoring every bite. "This is really good," he said finally. Elena smiled, and Samuel realized it was the first time he'd seen her really smile since he found her. "My mother taught me before she died. She said a woman should know how to make a good meal, no matter what else was happening in her life." Samuel nodded, though he didn't know what to say. He'd never been good with words, especially around women, but Elena didn't seem to mind his silence. She just kept eating, occasionally looking around the room like she was trying to memorize it. The next morning, Samuel found her in the barn, talking softly to his horse, Rusty. The old gelding was usually skittish around strangers, but he was letting Elena pet his nose and feed him apple slices from her pocket. "He's beautiful," she said when she noticed Samuel watching. "What's his name?" "Rusty," Samuel replied. "He's been with me for 8 years. Usually doesn't like people much." Elena laughed, and the sound made Samuel's heart skip a beat. "Maybe he can tell I'm not really people. I'm just a lost soul looking for a home." There was something sad in her voice that made Samuel want to comfort her, but he didn't know how. Instead, he showed her how to properly curry the horse standing close, enough to smell the soap she'd used to wash her hair. It was a clean, simple smell that reminded him of spring rain. Over the following days, Elena proved herself more useful than Samuel had imagined. She could mend clothes better than the seamstress in town, and she knew how to preserve food and make medicines from herbs. When one of his cows got sick, she helped him tend to it, holding the animal steady while he administered medicine. "How do you know about cattle?" Samuel asked as they walked back to the house. "I grew up on a farm before we moved to the city," Elena explained. "My father had a few cows and some chickens. I was too young to remember much, but I guess some things stick with you." Samuel found himself looking forward to these conversations. Elena had a way of talking that made even simple things seem interesting. She asked questions about the ranch, about his family, about life in Montana, but she never pushed when he didn't want to answer, and she never made him feel foolish for his simple way of life. 2 weeks after he'd found her, Samuel realized he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble you could fix with hard work or money, but the kind that came from caring about someone when you'd sworn you never would again. He'd catch himself watching Elena as she worked, noticing the way she hummed while she cooked or how she always checked on the animals. Before going to bed, the breaking point came on a cold April night when a late spring storm threatened his newborn calves. Samuel had been expecting trouble all day, watching the sky grow darker and feeling the pressure drop. These spring storms could be worse than winter ones, bringing not just snow, but freezing rain that could kill young cattle. I need to get the calves moved to the barn, he told Elena over dinner. This storm's going to be bad. Elena looked out the window at the swirling snow. I'll help you. Samuel shook his head. It's dangerous out there. The wind's picking up, and it'll be hard to see. I can handle it alone. No, Elena said firmly. You said yourself it's dangerous. What if something happens to you? What if you get hurt and can't get back to the house? Samuel wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in her eyes. She was right, too. Working alone in a storm was risky, and having someone to help would make the job faster and safer. They bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they could find and headed out into the storm. The wind was howling like a wild animal, and the snow was coming down so hard it was like walking through a white curtain. Samuel had to shout to be heard over the noise. Stay close to me, he yelled. Don't let go of my hand. Elena nodded and gripped his hand tightly. Her fingers were small and cold, but her grip was strong. They made their way to the pasture where the cattle were huddled together. The mothers trying to protect their babies from the wind and snow. Moving cattle in a storm was dangerous work. The animals were scared and confused, and they didn't want to leave their familiar pasture. Samuel and Elena worked together, guiding the cows and calves toward the barn, one small group at a time. Elena proved to be fearless, staying calm even when a frightened cow nearly knocked her over. It took them 3 hours to get all the animals to safety. By the time they finished, they were both exhausted and soaked through. Their faces were red from the cold, and their clothes were covered in mud and snow. But all the calves were safe and warm in the barn. Standing there in the barn, surrounded by the cattle they'd saved, Samuel looked at Elena and felt something shift inside him. Her dark hair was plastered to her head with melted snow, and there was mud on her cheek. Her clothes were soaked and dirty, and she was shivering from the cold, but she was smiling. We did it, she said breathlessly. We saved them all. Samuel nodded, but he couldn't speak. He was looking at Elena like he was seeing her for the first time. This wasn't the helpless woman he'd found in his barn. This was someone who could work beside him, who could face danger without complaining, who cared about his animals as much as he did. Elena, he started to say, but she was already turning away, checking on one of the calves that seemed smaller than the others. This little one looks cold, she said, kneeling down beside the calf. Do you have an extra blanket? Samuel found a horse blanket and watched as Elena wrapped it around the calf with gentle hands. The mother cow watched nervously but didn't try to stop her. Even the animals trusted Elena now. As they walked back to the house, Samuel felt his carefully built walls starting to crumble. He'd spent 3 years convincing himself that he was better off alone, that caring about someone would only lead to heartbreak. But Elena was making him remember what it felt like to have a partner, someone who would stand beside him no matter what. The problem was, he didn't know if Elena felt the same way. She'd been grateful for his help, and she'd worked hard to earn her keep, but that didn't mean she wanted to stay. She was still a woman who'd come west looking for a husband, and he was still a man who'd sworn off marriage. That night, as they sat by the fire drying their clothes, Samuel found himself stealing glances at Elena. She was reading one of his books, her brow furrowed in concentration. Every now and then, she'd look up and catch him watching her, and they'd both look away quickly. Samuel realized he was falling in love with her, and it scared him more than any storm ever could. Word travels fast in a small town, and it didn't take long for people to start talking about the mysterious woman living at Samuel's ranch. At first, it was just curious whispers at the general store and wondering glances when Samuel came to town for supplies. But as weeks turned into a month, the whispers grew louder and more pointed. Samuel first noticed the change when he went to buy feed for the cattle. Usually, the store owner, Mr. Wilson, would chat about the weather and ask about his livestock. This time, Wilson barely looked at him, just tallied up his purchases with a tight-lipped expression. "Everything all right, Wilson?" Samuel asked, counting out his money. Wilson glanced around the store, then leaned closer. "Look, Samuel, it's none of my business what you do on your own land. But people are talking They're saying you got a woman living with you and she's not your wife. Samuel felt his face flush with anger. What people say is their business. What I do on my ranch is mine. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing, Wilson said, holding up his hands. Some folks think it's not proper, that's all. Especially with her being one of those mail-order brides. Samuel grabbed his supplies and headed for the door. Tell those folks to mind their own business. But the damage was done. As Samuel walked down the main street, he could feel eyes watching him from every window. Mrs. Henderson turned away when he tipped his hat to her. The preacher's wife crossed to the other side of the street. Even children seemed to stare at him with curious eyes. The worst part was that Samuel knew they had a point. Elena was living in his house, cooking his meals, sharing his daily life. To anyone looking from the outside, it would seem like they were living as husband and wife, without the benefit of marriage. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, that was scandalous. Samuel drove his wagon home with a heavy heart. He'd been so focused on his growing feelings for Elena that he hadn't thought about how their arrangement looked to other people. Now he realized he'd put Elena in a difficult position. If word got around that she was living improperly with a man, it would ruin her reputation forever. Elena was hanging laundry on the line when he got home. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, but her smile faded when she noticed his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, walking over to meet him. Samuel didn't know how to explain without hurting her feelings. "People in town are talking," he said finally. "About you staying here." Elena's face went pale. "What kind of talking?" "They think it's not proper for an unmarried woman to be living with an unmarried man," Samuel said. "They don't understand." "That you're just, that we're not ... that we're not what?" Elena asked quietly. Samuel looked at her standing there in the afternoon sun, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes full of hurt and confusion. He wanted to tell her that they were more than just two people sharing a house. He wanted to tell her that he cared about her more than he'd ever cared about anyone. But the words stuck in his throat. "They don't understand that you're just staying here temporarily," he said instead. "Until you figure out what you want to do next?" Elena nodded, but Samuel could see the pain in her eyes. "I see. And what do you think I should do next?" Before Samuel could answer, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. A man on a brown horse was riding up the path to the house, and as he got closer, Samuel recognized him. It was Thomas Brennan, the man who'd abandoned Elena in the storm. Elena saw him too, and she stepped closer to Samuel without thinking. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Thomas." Samuel felt anger surge through him like a wildfire. This was the man who'd left Elena to die in a blizzard, who'd treated her like she was worthless. Samuel stepped forward, putting himself between Elena and Brennan. Brennan dismounted his horse and walked toward them with a confident swagger. He was a big man, well-dressed and well-fed, with the kind of arrogance that came from having money, and thinking it made him better than everyone else. Well, Brennan said, looking Elena up and down like she was a piece of property. "There's my runaway bride." "She's not your anything," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. Brennan ignored him and spoke directly to Elena. "I've been hearing interesting stories about you, Elena, living here with this man, playing house like a proper wife. Seems like you've learned some new tricks since I last saw you." Elena lifted her chin defiantly. "What do you want, Thomas?" "What I want is what belongs to me," Brennan said. "I paid for your train ticket. I arranged for our wedding. You cost me time and money, and now I hear you're giving away for free what I was willing to pay for." Samuel took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You need to leave. Now." Brennan finally looked at Samuel, sizing him up like he was considering whether Samuel was worth worrying about. "This is between me and my intended bride. She signed a contract to marry me, and I'm willing to honor that contract." "You left me to die in a storm," Elena said, her voice shaking with anger. "You called me worthless and threw me out of your wagon like garbage." "I was having second thoughts," Brennan said with a shrug. "A man's allowed to change his mind. But I've been thinking about it, and I've decided you might work out after all." The townspeople are talking about how you've been keeping house for Hayes here. If you can satisfy him, you can certainly satisfy me. Samuel saw red. Before he knew what he was doing, he grabbed Brennan by the front of his shirt and lifted him off the ground. You talk to her like that again, and I'll throw you off my land in pieces. Brennan struggled in Samuel's grip, but Samuel was stronger from years of ranch work. You can't keep her, Hayes. She's mine by right. I have the contract and the letters to prove it. I don't belong to anyone, Elena said, her voice ringing with authority. I'm not a piece of property to be bought and sold. Samuel released Brennan, who stumbled backward and straightened his clothes. You think you can just walk away from your obligations? Brennan asked Elena. You think you can live here playing house with Hayes and no one will care? What Elena does is her choice, Samuel said. And she's chosen not to marry you. Brennan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Has she chosen to marry you instead? Because if she hasn't, then she's just a fallen woman living in sin. And if that's the case, she might as well be living in sin with me. At least I can give her a proper house and a respectable name. Elena stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. I would rather live in a cave eating roots and berries than spend one day married to you, Thomas Brennan. You're a cruel, selfish man who thinks money can buy anything, including people, but you can't buy me. We'll see about that, Brennan said, mounting his horse. I'm going to tell everyone in town exactly what kind of woman you are, Elena. Going to tell them how you ran away from your wedding to live with another man. We'll see how long Hayes wants to keep you then. He rode away, leaving Samuel and Elena standing in the yard, both shaken by the confrontation. Samuel watched until Brennan disappeared over the hill, then turned to Elena. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry he found you here. I'm sorry he talked to you like that. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. He's right, about what people will think, about my reputation. I don't care what people think, Samuel said. But you should, Elena replied. And I should too. I've brought shame on your house, Samuel. I've put you in a position where people question your character because of me. Samuel wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. In a small town, reputation mattered. If people thought Elena was living improperly, it would hurt both of them. What do you want to do? He asked. Elena wiped her eyes and looked at him with a sad smile. I think it's time for me to go. I've imposed on your kindness long enough. Samuel felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Go where? I don't know, Elena said. Maybe back east, maybe somewhere else out west, but I can't stay here anymore. It's not fair to you. That night, Samuel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Elena's words. He could hear her moving around in the kitchen, probably packing her few belongings. Tomorrow she would leave and his house would be empty again, but this time the emptiness would be different. This time he would know exactly what he was missing. Samuel didn't sleep at all that night. He lay in bed listening to Elena moving around the house, packing her things, preparing to leave his life forever. Every sound felt like a nail being hammered into his coffin. The creaking floorboards, the soft closing of drawers, the gentle rustling of fabric as she folded her few dresses. When morning came, Samuel got dressed and went outside to do his chores, but his heart wasn't in it. The cattle needed feeding, the horses needed water, and there were a dozen other tasks that required his attention. But all he could think about was Elena leaving. He'd arranged for old Pete, his neighbor, to drive Elena to the train station in town. Pete had asked no questions when Samuel rode over before dawn to make the request. He just nodded and said he'd be there by noon. That gave Samuel a few more hours with Elena, though he didn't know what to say to her. Elena was in the kitchen when he came back inside, making breakfast like it was any other morning. But Samuel could see her small bag packed and waiting by the door. She'd changed back into the dress she'd been wearing when he found her, though it was clean and mended now. She looked beautiful and sad and determined all at the same time. You don't have to cook, Samuel said, hanging his hat on the peg. I can make something simple. I want to, Elena replied without looking at him. It's the last meal I'll make in this kitchen. I want it to be a good one. They ate in silence, both of them stealing glances at each other, but neither knowing what to say. The eggs were perfect, the bacon was crispy, and the coffee was strong, just the way Samuel liked it. But everything tasted like sawdust in his mouth. After breakfast, Samuel found excuses to stay busy. He checked on the cattle twice, repaired a fence that didn't really need repairing, and spent an hour brushing down the horses. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, he knew he was running out of time. At 11:30, he found Elena in the barn. She was standing in the same stall where he'd found her months ago, running her hand along Rusty's neck and whispering something to the old horse. The morning light streaming through the barn doors made her hair shine like polished wood. "Saying goodbye?" Samuel asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Elena turned around and he could see she'd been crying. "He's a good horse." "You're lucky to have him," Samuel nodded, though his throat felt tight. "He likes you. He's never taken to anyone the way he's taken to you." They stood there in awkward silence, with Rusty snorting softly between them. Samuel wanted to say so many things, but every word seemed to stick in his throat. How could he tell her that she'd brought light into his dark world? How could he explain that the thought of going back to his lonely life made him feel sick? "Elena," he started, then stopped. "What is it?" she asked gently. Samuel took a deep breath and tried to find his courage. "I need to tell you something. About why I never wanted to get married." Elena waited patiently while Samuel gathered his thoughts. He'd never told anyone the whole truth about Catherine, not even his closest friends. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Catherine, he began. I thought I loved her, and I thought she loved me. But when a richer man came to town, she left me for him. She said I couldn't give her the kind of life she deserved. Elena's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. That must have hurt terribly." "It did," Samuel admitted. "But not just because she left. It hurt because I realized she never really saw me. She saw what I could provide, or in her case, what I couldn't provide. She never saw who I really was." Samuel walked closer to Elena, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "But you're different. From the very first day you saw me. Not what I owned or how much money I had, but who I really was. You worked beside me, you cared about my animals, you made my house feel like a home." Elena's eyes filled with tears again. Samuel ... "I'm not finished," he said quickly, afraid that if he stopped now he'd lose his nerve. "I know you came here looking for a husband. I know you wanted a marriage, a real partnership with someone. And I know I told myself I didn't want those things. But I was lying." Elena stared at him, her hand still resting on Rusty's neck. "The truth is, I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you in this barn," Samuel continued. "Not because you needed rescuing, but because of who you are. You're strong and kind and brave. You're everything I never knew I was looking for." Tears were flowing freely down Elena's cheeks now. "But the town, what people will say." "Let them talk," Samuel said fiercely. "I don't care about their gossip. I care about you. I care about us." Elena shook her head. "You don't understand. If I stay, if people think we're living in sin, it will hurt your reputation, your business, everything you've worked for." Samuel stepped closer, close enough to reach out and touch her face. "Then marry me." Elena's eyes widened in shock. "What? Marry me?" Samuel repeated, his voice stronger now. "Not because you need a husband or because I need a wife, but because we love each other. Because we're better together than we are apart." Elena searched his face, looking for any sign that he didn't mean what he was saying. "Are you sure? Are you really sure?" "Because I won't be like Catherine. I won't leave if things get hard. But I also won't stay if you're only asking because you feel sorry for me." Samuel took her hands in his, feeling how small and soft they were compared to his own rough, calloused fingers. "I'm not asking because I feel sorry for you. I'm asking because the thought of you leaving is tearing me apart. I'm asking because when I think about my future, all I can see is you." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Then she smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Samuel. I've been trying not to, because I thought you didn't want me to stay, but I love you." Samuel felt like he could breathe again for the first time in hours. So you'll marry me? Really marry me? Yes, Elena whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Samuel pulled her into his arms and kissed her, right there in the barn with Rusty watching. It was a gentle kiss, full of promise and hope and all the love they'd been too afraid to speak aloud. When they broke apart, Elena laughed. Poor Pete is going to be very confused when he gets here and finds out he doesn't need to drive me to the train station. Samuel grinned. We'll send him to town to get the preacher instead. They were married 3 days later in the same barn where their story began. The preacher, Reverend Johnson, had been surprised by the sudden request but agreed to perform the ceremony. Pete stood as Samuel's witness and Mrs. Johnson from the general store stood for Elena. The wedding was simple. Elena wore a new dress that Mrs. Johnson had helped her make, a simple blue one that brought out the color of her eyes. Samuel wore his best suit, the one he'd bought years ago for his failed wedding to Catherine, but this time felt completely different. This time he was marrying someone who loved him for exactly who he was. As they exchanged vows, Samuel looked into Elena's eyes and saw his future. Not a future he'd planned or expected, but one that was better than anything he could have imagined. Elena promised to love him in sickness and health, in good times and bad, and Samuel knew she meant every word. When the ceremony was over, the small group celebrated with cake and coffee in Samuel's house. The same house where Elena had recovered from her ordeal, where they'd shared countless meals and quiet conversations, where they'd fallen in love without even realizing it. As the sun set on their wedding day, Samuel and Elena stood on their front porch, looking out over the ranch that was now truly theirs. The cattle were settling down for the night, the horses were peaceful in their pasture, and everything felt exactly as it should be. Do you ever think about what would have happened if that storm hadn't come? Elena asked, leaning against Samuel's shoulder. Samuel wrapped his arms around his wife and smiled. Sometimes. But then I remember that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places. Even freezing barn lofts on winter nights. Elena laughed and turned in his arms to kiss him. I love you, Samuel Hayes. I love you too, Elena Hayes, he replied, still amazed that she was really his wife. As they went inside their house together, Samuel realized that his lonely days were over. He'd found not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who would stand beside him through whatever storms life might bring. And for the first time in 3 years, Samuel Hayes was completely, perfectly happy.